The Mafia boss found a waitress, crying in his restaurant kitchen. Her secret shocked him. "Who gave you permission to weep in my kitchen?" Brooks's voice, a low, gravelly rasp forged in the city's darkest corners, shattered the silence of the after-hours restaurant. Adeline gasped, dropping the bloody towel she'd been using to staunch the cut on her palm. She spun around, terrified. The man standing in the doorway wasn't just the owner of the upscale eatery. Brooks was the undisputed boss of the city's most feared syndicate. I'm sorry," she stammered, tears carving tracks through the flour on her pale cheeks. "I was just leaving." Brooks stepped into the harsh fluorescent light, his eyes locking onto a crumpled photograph she had hastily tried to hide beneath a cutting board. "Don't lie to me," he whispered. "What is that?" The ambient hum of the industrial refrigerators was the only sound left in the sprawling kitchen of Lombra. The restaurant, a crown jewel in the city's bustling culinary district, was a masterpiece of polished mahogany, velvet drapes, and crystal chandeliers out front. But here, in the back, it was a fortress of stainless steel and sharp edges. This was where the real work happened. And for Brooks, it was the only place he felt truly grounded. He wasn't a man who belonged in the velvet-lined dining rooms of his own making. He belonged in the trenches. Tonight, the trenches were empty, save for the lingering sense of roasted garlic, rich marinara, and the sharp chemical tang of industrial bleach. The kitchen staff had clocked out hours ago, scattering into the damp, neon-lit night of the city. Brooks walked with a heavy, deliberate gait, his expensive leather shoes clicking softly against the pristine, slip-resistant tiles. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and controlled violence, his tailored suit hiding the scars of a lifetime spent, clawing his way out of the gutter. He was running through his mental checklist inventory, the weekly drop from his lieutenants, the quiet payoffs to the local precinct when he heard it. A soft, jagged sound, like a bird trapped in a snare, a sob. He froze. His hand instinctually drifted toward the holster concealed beneath his tailored jacket, an old habit that refused to die. In his world, after-hours noises usually meant a rival crew, an ambitious hitman, or a raid. But this sound was different. It lacked the heavy, calculated breathing of an assassin. It was raw, broken, and deeply human. Brooks released his grip on the weapon and moved silently toward the sound, his footsteps swallowed by the vastness of the kitchen. He found her in the far corner, huddled near the deep prep sinks. Adeline. She was a new hire, a waitress who had been working the floor for barely a month. Brooks prided himself on knowing every face in his organization, from his top enforcers down to the busboys. He had noted Adeline because she possessed a quiet, frantic energy, like a deer constantly scanning the tree line for wolves. She was small, with dark hair hastily tied back in a messy knot, and eyes that held an exhaustion far beyond her years. Tonight, she looked entirely broken. She was sitting on an overturned milk crate, her knees pulled up to her chest, trembling violently. A stark white dish towel, stained with a startling bloom of bright crimson, was wrapped tightly around her left hand. But it wasn't the physical injury that had caught Brooks's attention. It was the sheer, unadulterated despair radiating from her. She was staring at a crumpled piece of paper, a photograph clutched in her good hand, her tears falling freely, landing with soft taps on the steel floor. When Brooks spoke the words that shattered her isolation, he didn't mean to sound as cruel as he did. But his voice, hardened by years of issuing orders that ended men's lives, knew no other register. The effect was instantaneous and violent. Adeline jumped, her entire body seizing with terror. The bloody towel fell away, revealing a deep, ugly gash across her palm, undoubtedly from a slipped paring knife during the frenzied closing shift. But she didn't seem to care about the blood dripping onto the floor. Her frantic movements were entirely focused on the photograph. With a clumsy, desperate swipe, she tried to shove it under the large wooden cutting board on the prep station. Brooks did not move quickly. He never had to. He simply closed the distance between them with slow, measured steps, dominating the physical space with his sheer presence. The air in the kitchen seemed to grow heavier, thicker, as he approached. He stopped just inches from her, staring down at her trembling frame. She was terrified of him, and he knew it. Everyone in the city knew the rumors about the owner of Lombra. They knew that the restaurant was merely the pristine face of a very dark, very bloody empire. "I asked you a question, Adeline," Brooks said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming softer, which only made it more menacing. He deliberately used her name, a subtle flex of his power, proving that he knew exactly who she was. "It's nothing, Mr. Brooks. I swear it's nothing. I was just cleaning up and I slipped. I'm sorry about the floor. I'll clean the blood. I'll clock out right now. Please," she babbled, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic, disjointed rush. She refused to meet his eyes, keeping her gaze locked on the toes of his polished shoes. Brooks ignored her panicked apologies. He reached out, his large, calloused hand hovering over the cutting board. "You're bleeding on my floor, you're crying on my time, and you're lying to my face," he stated, his tone completely devoid of emotion. "I don't tolerate any of those 3 things in my establishment. Now, step aside." Adeline froze, caught between the instinct to protect whatever was in that photograph and the paralyzing fear of the man standing before her. For a long, agonizing second, Brooks thought she might actually defy him. He saw a flash of pure, desperate defiance in her red-rimmed eyes. But then, the survival instinct took over. Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her as quickly as it had appeared. She took a step back, wrapping her injured hand in the bloody towel once more, holding it tight against her chest, as if to protect her heart. Brooks reached under the heavy wooden board and pulled out the crumpled photograph. It was slightly damp from her tears, the edges frayed from being handled too many times. He smoothed it out against the harsh glare of the overhead lights, his expression a mask of impenetrable stone. The kitchen was entirely silent, save for the ragged sound of Adeline's breathing. Brooks stared at the image, his mind working rapidly, analyzing the data, searching for the threat, the angle, the con. But what he saw in the photograph completely short-circuited his cynical expectations. It wasn't a picture of a rival boss. It wasn't a ledger. It was something far more dangerous and far more tragic. The photograph was a Polaroid, its colors slightly washed out by the harsh, artificial lighting of what was unmistakably a hospital room. The central focus of the image was a young boy, perhaps 9 or 10 years old, lying utterly motionless in a tangle of white sheets and translucent plastic tubing. His head was wrapped in thick, white bandages, and a complicated scaffolding of metal halos and pins held his neck rigid. Despite the medical apparatus obscuring his face, the family resemblance was undeniable. He had Adeline's dark hair, though his was cropped short, and the same delicate bone structure around the jaw. The boy looked incredibly small, incredibly fragile, as if a strong gust of wind could shatter him completely. Brooks stood perfectly still, the photograph held lightly between his thick fingers. He had seen a lot of death in his life. He had seen the aftermath of violence, the broken bodies of men who had crossed him, the weeping widows and the collateral damage of his chosen profession. But this was different. This wasn't the result of the game. This was the brutal, indifferent cruelty of the world. And yet, there was something else. A tension in the air, a specific flavor of fear radiating from Adeline that didn't just stem from a tragic accident. It was the fear of a hunted animal. "Your brother?" Brooks asked, his voice softer now, the gravelly edge smoothed over by a genuine, if begrudging, curiosity. Adeline flinched, as if the sound of his voice was a physical blow. She nodded slowly, her eyes darting toward the exits, calculating distances she knew she couldn't cross in time. "Leo," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerators. "His name is Leo. What happened to him?" Brooks demanded, his gaze remaining fixed on the photograph. He noticed a date stamped on the bottom corner of the image. It was recent, less than a month ago, around the exact time Adeline had walked into his restaurant, desperate for a job, willing to take the grueling closing shifts that no one else wanted. "A car," Adeline said, her voice cracking. "A hit and run. He was crossing the street after school. They didn't even slow down." Brooks finally looked up from the photograph, his piercing dark eyes locking onto hers. He was a master at reading people. He could spot a lie in the twitch of a muscle, the shift of a glance, the sudden change in breathing. Adeline was telling the truth about the accident, but she was holding something back. The narrative was incomplete. A tragic accident explained the tears, the exhaustion, the desperate need for money. It did not explain the sheer terror he had witnessed when he first entered the room. "Hit and runs happen every day in this city," Brooks said, his tone clinical, detached. It's a tragedy, but it doesn't explain why you're hiding in my kitchen. Bleeding. Looking like someone is holding a gun to your head. Who are you hiding from, Adeline? No one, she blurted out much too quickly. The lie hung in the air, obvious and clumsy. The medical bills, they're astronomical. The insurance won't cover the long-term care he needs. The specialized surgeries. I've been working double shifts, but it's not enough. It's never enough. I was just overwhelmed. I'm sorry. Brooks stepped forward, closing the distance between them again. Adeline backed up until her shoulders hit the cold stainless steel of the industrial oven. She was trapped. I run a very complicated business, Adeline, Brooks said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate whisper. And in my business, I survive because I know everything that happens in my territory. I know who owes who. I know who is sleeping with who, and I know when someone is lying to me. You are lying. You are terrified of something specific, not an abstract hospital bill. A person. A consequence. Now, I will ask you one last time. Who is threatening you? Adeline squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head frantically. Please, Mr. Brooks, just fire me, let me go. If I tell you, if anyone finds out I talked, it'll be worse for Leo. They said they'd visit the hospital. They said they'd unplug the machines. The words hit Brooks like a physical strike. They, plural, a debt, a threat to a child in a hospital bed. This wasn't a standard collections agency. This was the underworld, and this was his city. If someone was running an extortion racket this ruthless, using a crippled child as leverage, Brooks needed to know about it. Not out of a sense of altruism, he was a mob boss, not a saint, but because unauthorized rackets brought heat, and heat brought the police. Brooks reached into his pocket and pulled out a pristine, monogrammed linen handkerchief. He held it out to her. Wrap your hand properly, he ordered. You're ruining the apron. Adeline looked at the handkerchief, then up at him, entirely bewildered by the shift in his demeanor. Hesitantly, she took the linen cloth, her bloody fingers trembling as she wrapped it around her injured palm. You are going to walk out the back door, Brooks continued, his voice devoid of any warmth. You are going to go home. You are going to take tomorrow off. Paid. And when you come back on Friday, you are going to work your shift as if nothing happened. Do you understand me? Adeline nodded frantically, too stunned to form words. And Adeline? Brooks paused, his hand resting on the heavy metal handle of the back exit. Do not think for a second that this conversation is over. I find out everything eventually. He pushed the door open, the cold, damp air of the alley rushing in, carrying the scent of rotting garbage and rain. He watched as she scrambled out into the darkness, clutching her ruined hand, vanishing into the shadows of the city. As the door swung shut, locking with a heavy, metallic thud, Brooks pulled out his phone. He dialed a number he rarely used this late at night. Mateo, Brooks said when the line connected, his voice cold and flat. We have a problem. Put a tail on the new waitress, Adeline. 24 hours. I want to know everywhere she goes, everyone she talks to, and every debt she owes. Someone is playing in our sandbox. And they are being sloppy about it. The rain in this city never seemed to clean anything. It only smeared the grime around, making the streets slick and treacherous. Brooks sat in the back of his heavily tinted, armored sedan, the engine idling with a deep, barely audible purr. He was parked across the street from a crumbling brick tenement building in the city's poorest district. This was a place where the streetlights were perpetually broken, and the police only came in heavily armed convoys. It was far from the polished mahogany and velvet of Lombra. It was a place of desperation. For the past 48 hours, Brooks had watched the surveillance reports roll in from Mateo. Adeline's life was a brutal, monotonous cycle of exhaustion. She left her apartment at dawn, took 2 different buses to the hospital, sat by her brother's unresponsive side for hours, left to work a grinding shift at the restaurant, and returned to this decaying building long after midnight. She bought no luxuries, ate meager meals consisting mostly of instant noodles, and spoke to almost no one. She was a ghost, haunting her own life. But it was what happened on the second night that brought Brooks out into the rain himself. He watched through the rain-streaked window as Adeline descended the steps of a city bus, pulling her thin, worn coat tight around her narrow shoulders. She walked with her head down, splashing through oily puddles, rushing toward the fragile sanctuary of her apartment building. She didn't make it to the door. From the shadows of a narrow alleyway beside the building, a figure emerged. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, wearing a cheap leather jacket that strained against his bulk. Even through the rain and the gloom, Brooks recognized the silhouette immediately, the heavy, rolling gait, the aggressive posture. It was Silas. Silas was a mid-level enforcer, a muscle for hire who reported to one of Brooks's captains on the south side. He was a brute, useful for intimidating stubborn union bosses or breaking the legs of rival dealers, but he lacked the intellect for complex operations. Seeing him here, accosting a waitress in the rain, sent a cold spike of fury through Brooks's chest. Brooks watched, his jaw clenching tightly, as Silas stepped into Adeline's path, blocking her way. Adeline physically recoiled, her body language screaming panic. She looked around the empty street, seeking help she knew wouldn't come. Silas leaned in close, towering over her, his body language aggressive, predatory. He reached out and grabbed her arm, the same arm with the bandaged hand. Brooks saw Adeline wince, her knees buckling slightly beneath the pressure. Through the thick glass of his car, Brooks couldn't hear the words being exchanged, but the pantomime was crystal clear. Silas was demanding something. Adeline was pleading, shaking her head, gesturing frantically with her free hand. Silas tightened his grip, pulling her closer, his face inches from hers. He raised his other hand, pointing a thick, blunt finger in the direction of the city hospital. The threat was obvious. Pay up, or the boy suffers. Adeline, broken and terrified, reached into the pocket of her coat with trembling fingers. She pulled out a thin, plain white envelope. It looked pathetic, crumpled and slightly damp. Silas snatched it from her hand, his lips curling into a sneer. He didn't even bother to count it. He simply shoved it into the inner pocket of his jacket. Shoved Adeline roughly by the shoulder, sending her stumbling backward onto the wet pavement, and turned, walking away into the night as if he had merely collected a dry cleaning ticket. Adeline stayed on the wet concrete for a long moment, the rain soaking through her clothes, her face buried in her hands. Brooks watched her, a dark, dangerous storm brewing behind his stoic expression. He didn't order his driver to intervene. He didn't step out of the car to comfort her. In Brooks's world, premature action was fatal. He needed to understand the entire architecture of the betrayal before he started tearing down the building. If Silas was shaking down a waitress for medical debt, he wasn't doing it alone. Silas didn't have the brains to run his own book. He was kicking that money up to someone higher in Brooks's organization. Someone was running an unsanctioned, predatory loan sharking operation, targeting the absolute bottom rung of society, using Brooks's fear, Brooks's reputation, to line their own pockets. It was a gross violation of Brooks's code. He was a criminal, a murderer, a thief on a grand scale, but he had rules. He preyed on the corrupt, the greedy, the rival syndicates. He did not bleed weeping women and crippled children. It was bad for business, and it was a stain on the twisted honor he clung to. "Drive," Brooks said softly, his voice cutting through the quiet interior of the car. "Where to, boss?" the driver asked, glancing nervously in the rearview mirror. "The office," Brooks replied, his eyes still fixed on the miserable, wet figure of Adeline as the car pulled away from the curb. "Call Mateo. Tell him I need the ledgers for the Southside territory. All of them. The official ones, and the ones they think I don't know about. We have a rat in the walls, and it's time to set a trap." Brooks's private office, located above a heavily fortified, legitimate shipping warehouse near the docks, was a stark contrast to the opulent dining room of Lombra. There was no velvet here, no crystal. It was functional, intimidating, and soundproof. The walls were lined with heavy oak bookshelves, and the air always smelled faintly of stale cigar smoke and old paper. The centerpiece of the room was a massive, scarred mahogany desk that looked as though it could withstand a mortar strike. At 3 a.m., the only light in the room came from a green-shaded banker's lamp on the desk, casting long, deep shadows against the walls. Brooks sat behind the desk, his jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled up, revealing the intricate, faded tattoos that covered his forearms, remnants of a violent youth he had long since refined but never truly escaped. Across from him stood Mateo. Mateo was Brooks's underboss, his oldest friend, and the only man in the city who could look Brooks in the eye without flinching. Mateo was tall, immaculately dressed in a sharp gray suit, with silver at his temples and eyes that had seen just as much blood as Brooks's. He watched silently as Brooks methodically flipped through the pages of 3 different leather-bound books. These were the ledgers. The lifeblood of the syndicate mapped out in columns of blue and red ink. Silas reports to Vinny the Jaw Russo, Brooks said, his voice a low rumble, breaking a silence that had lasted for nearly an hour. He didn't look up from the numbers. Correct, Matteo replied smoothly. Vinny runs the docks, the gambling parlors on the south side, and the sanctioned lending operations. He's been a top earner for 5 years. Look at this, Matteo, Brooks said, finally leaning back and spinning the ledger around so his underboss could see it. He tapped a thick finger against a column of numbers. These are Vinny's sanctioned loans. Small businesses, degenerate gamblers, local politicians who need walking around money. The interest rates are high, but they are standard. And more importantly, the default rate is low, and the enforcement costs are negligible. It's clean. Matteo leaned over the desk, his eyes scanning the numbers. Agreed. Vinny runs a tight ship. So what's the problem? Brooks reached into a drawer and pulled out a manila folder, tossing it onto the desk. The problem is that Silas isn't collecting from degenerate gamblers. He's collecting from a waitress who makes minimum wage plus tips. She owes a massive medical debt. I watched Silas take an envelope from her tonight. It wasn't a standard payment. It was a shakedown. Pure, predatory extraction. Matteo frowned, picking up the folder. Inside were the surveillance photos his men had taken over the past 2 days, along with financial background checks on Adeline. Medical debt. Matteo mused, flipping through the pages. Vinny doesn't buy medical debt. It's too messy. High default rate, terrible optics. The local news gets wind of us breaking the legs of cancer patients. It brings the FBI down on our heads. Exactly, Brooks said, his eyes darkening. Vinny knows my rules. We don't touch the innocent, we don't touch kids, and we don't run predatory rackets on the working poor. It's sloppy, and it breeds resentment. So, Silas has gone rogue? Matteo suggested. Running a side hustle? Brooks shook his head slowly. Silas is muscle. He can barely count to 20 without taking off his shoes. He doesn't have the capital to float loans, and he doesn't have the brains to manage the collections. He's an attack dog, which means someone is holding his leash. Someone with capital, someone with ambition, and someone who thinks I'm too blind or too soft to notice. Brooks stood up, walking over to a heavy crystal decanter on a side table. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a glass, offering none to Matteo, who he knew never drank while working. If Vinny is running an off-the-books book, Brooks said, taking a slow sip, the liquor burning a pleasant trail down his throat. And he's using our enforcers to collect on it. He's stealing from me. He's using my reputation to line his own pockets, and he's violating the code that keeps this city from descending into absolute chaos. Do you want me to bring Vinny in? Matteo asked, his voice tightening slightly. Bringing a captain in for questioning usually ended in a burial. Not yet, Brooks said, turning to face his underboss. If Vinny is brazen enough to run this under my nose, he's taking precautions. If we move on him without solid proof, his crew might splinter. We need a paper trail. We need the location of his shadow book. And to get that, we need to squeeze the weakest link. Silas, Matteo stated. No. Brooks corrected softly, his mind flashing back to the pale, terrified face of the waitress in his kitchen. Silas will just clam up, expecting Vinny to protect him. We squeeze the victim. We find out exactly how deep this rot goes. I want to know exactly what they offered her, what the terms are, and how they threatened her brother. You want to interrogate the waitress? Matteo raised an eyebrow, a rare display of surprise. Brooks, she's a civilian. If you push her too hard, she might snap and run to the cops. She won't run to the cops, Brooks said, setting his empty glass down with a definitive clink. She's too afraid for her brother. The cops can't protect him in a hospital bed, and she knows it. She knows the only law that matters right now is ours. Brooks walked back to his desk, picking up the surveillance photo of Adeline standing in the rain, looking utterly broken. Bring her to me tomorrow. Not in the alley. Not at the restaurant. Bring her here, to the office. It's time she understands exactly who she's working for. The heavy mahogany door to Brooks's office opened with a quiet, solid click that sounded, to Adeline, like a prison cell slamming shut. She stood in the center of the expansive room, clutching her cheap canvas purse to her chest like a shield. Her bandaged hand throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. She had been escorted here directly from her apartment by Mateo, a man whose polite demeanor entirely failed to mask the lethal efficiency vibrating beneath his expensive suit. He hadn't threatened her. He had simply stated that Mr. Brooks requested her presence. And in this city, that was not a request one declined. The office smelled of leather, old paper, and power. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the afternoon sun, casting the room in a permanent, oppressive twilight. Brooks was sitting behind his massive desk. He didn't look up immediately. He was carefully signing a stack of documents with a thick fountain pen. The silence stretched, tight and brittle, amplifying the sound of Adeline's ragged breathing. Finally, Brooks capped the pen, set it down precisely parallel to the edge of his leather blotter, and looked up. His dark eyes locked onto hers, stripping away any pretense or facade she might have tried to muster. He gestured to one of the heavy leather armchairs positioned opposite his desk. "Sit, Adeline," he commanded. It wasn't a suggestion. Adeline moved stiffly, her legs feeling like lead. She sank into the oversized chair, feeling swallowed by it, diminishing her already small presence. She kept her eyes focused on the edge of the desk, terrified that if she met his gaze, he would see exactly how close she was to shattering completely. "Coffee?" Brooks asked, his tone surprisingly conversational. Before she could answer, he pressed a small button on his intercom. "Mateo, 2 coffees. Black." He steepled his fingers, leaning back in his chair, studying her. He noted the dark circles under her eyes, the slight tremor in her unbandaged hand, the cheap, frayed cuffs of her sweater. She looked like a casualty of war. "I assume you know why you're here," Brooks began, his voice low, resonating in the quiet room. Adeline swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. "You're firing me because of what happened in the kitchen. I understand. I should never have." "I don't fire people for crying, Adeline," Brooks interrupted smoothly. "If I did, half my kitchen staff would be gone during the holiday rush." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk, the distance between them suddenly feeling dangerously small. "You're here because of the man in the alley last night." "Silas." Adeline physically recoiled, her head snapping up, her eyes wide with shock and fresh terror. "How? How do you know about that? Were you following me?" "I know everything that happens in my territory," Brooks stated, repeating the phrase he had used in the kitchen, but this time it carried the full, crushing weight of his empire. "I know that Silas is a low-level enforcer. I know that he cornered you. I know that he put his hands on you. And I know that you handed him an envelope filled with money." Adeline started shaking her head frantically. "Please, Mr. Brooks, you have to stay out of this. You don't understand. If Silas finds out I talked to you, if his boss finds out—" "His boss," Brooks said softly, tasting the words. "And who do you think his boss is?" "I don't know his name," Adeline cried, her voice cracking, desperation bleeding through. "They just call him the banker. Silas said if I missed a payment, the banker would send someone to the hospital. To Leo. They said they know his room number. They know the nurse's schedule. Please, you have to let me go. I just need to keep working, keep paying them." At that moment, the door opened silently, and Mateo entered, carrying a silver tray with 2 steaming cups of espresso. He placed one in front of Adeline and one in front of Brooks, then retreated to the corner of the room, blending seamlessly into the shadows. Brooks ignored the coffee. He kept his gaze fixed on Adeline, his expression an impenetrable mask. "You are paying extortion money to a man who threatens a crippled child. You are doing this on a waitress's salary. It is a mathematical impossibility. You will default eventually. It is designed that way." "I have no choice," Adeline shouted, the sheer injustice of it all finally overriding her fear of the Mafia boss. Tears sprang to her eyes, hot and angry. "My brother needs specialized care. The insurance company dropped us after the accident. The hospital was going to transfer him to a state facility. He would die there. I had to get the money to keep him in the private ward. A man at the hospital, a janitor, he gave me a number. He said these people could offer a loan when the banks wouldn't. A predatory loan," Brooks clarified, his voice cold. "With an interest rate designed to trap you forever." "Yes," Adeline sobbed, wiping her face with her unbandaged hand. I borrowed $50,000 to cover the surgeries and secure his room. I've already paid back $20,000 in interest alone over the last 6 months, and the principal hasn't gone down a single dollar. If I stop paying, they hurt Leo. That's the trap, and I am caught in it. Brooks sat silently, digesting the information. The operation was insidious, targeting desperate families and hospitals, offering a lifeline that turned into a noose. It was a vile, cowardly way to make money, and it was happening in his city, under the umbrella of his syndicate. Adeline, Brooks said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register that made the hair on her arms stand up. Tell me exactly how the accident happened. The hit and run. Every detail you can remember. Adeline sniffled, wrapping her hands around the small, warm ceramic of the espresso cup, seeking some anchor in the storm of her own memories. The room was deathly quiet, waiting for her to speak. It was raining, she began, her voice trembling, transporting herself back to that awful afternoon 6 months ago. Like it always seems to be in this city, Leo had stayed late at school for a science club meeting. I was supposed to pick him up, but I was working my other job, at the diner across town. My manager wouldn't let me leave early. The guilt in her voice was a physical weight, dragging her down. I told Leo to take the bus, but he missed it. He decided to walk. Brooks remained perfectly still. A silent, imposing audience of one. Even Mateo, in the shadows, seemed to hold his breath. He was crossing at 4th and Elm, Adeline continued, a tear slipping down her cheek and splashing into her untouched coffee. It's a busy intersection, but he had the walk signal. There were witnesses. They said a vehicle blew through a red light going at least 60 miles an hour. It didn't even tap the brakes. It hit him. She choked on the words, squeezing her eyes shut as if trying to block out the mental image she had conjured 1,000 times. It hit him so hard it threw him 30 feet into a parked car. Did anyone get a description of the vehicle? Brooks asked, his tone clinical, though a dark fire was beginning to kindle in his eyes. Adeline nodded slowly, wiping her face. A large, black SUV with tinted windows. The police. The police said they couldn't find it. They said there were too many vehicles like that in the city. They checked the traffic cameras, but the footage was corrupted, or missing. They closed the case after 3 weeks. They just gave up. Brooks's jaw clenched. Traffic cameras didn't just malfunction randomly in this city, especially not at major intersections. The local precinct was firmly in the pocket of his syndicate. If footage disappeared, it was because someone paid handsomely for it to vanish. A sickening realization was beginning to form in his gut, a puzzle assembling itself with ugly, jagged pieces. Did the witnesses see anything else? Brooks pressed, his voice taut, like a wire about to snap. A partial plate? A dent? Anything? Adeline hesitated, looking down at her hands. There was one thing. An old woman who was waiting at the bus stop. The police dismissed her because her eyesight was bad, but she swore to me she saw the license plate, not the numbers, but a custom vanity frame. She said it was silver, with a very distinct emblem on it. 2 crossed anchors. The silence that followed her words was absolute, ringing in the heavy air of the office. In the corner of the room, Mateo shifted his weight, the rustle of his suit incredibly loud in the stillness. Brooks didn't move. He felt a cold, hard knot of pure rage forming in his chest. 2 crossed anchors. It was the emblem of the Southside Dockworkers Union. It was the specific, arrogant vanity plate used by Vinny the Jaw Russo's inner circle. Vinny's crew ran the docks. They fancied themselves pirates of the modern age. The picture was now horrifyingly complete. It wasn't just a rogue loan sharking operation. Vinny's crew, likely Silas or someone equally reckless, had been driving drunk or high, running a red light, and nearly killing a child. To cover it up, Vinny used his influence to erase the camera footage. And then, in a display of greed so monstrous it defied comprehension, someone in Vinny's crew realized the family of the boy they hit was desperate for medical funds. They sent their hospital connection to offer Adeline a loan to pay for the damage they had caused, trapping her in an endless cycle of extortion to profit off their own crime. It was a betrayal of everything Brooks stood for. It was a cancer eating away at his empire from the inside out. Brooks stood up slowly. The movement was smooth, but it carried the terrifying, suppressed energy of a coiled snake. He walked around the desk, standing over Adeline. She cowered slightly, anticipating violence. Instead, Brooks reached down and gently removed the coffee cup from her shaking hands, setting it on the desk. "Adeline," Brooks said, his voice entirely devoid of the gravelly menace he usually employed. It was eerily calm, the eye of a hurricane. "I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are not going to pay Silas another dime. You are not going to answer calls from blocked numbers. You are going to go to the hospital. You are going to sit with Leo. And you are not going to worry about the money." Adeline looked up at him, her eyes wide with frantic disbelief. But the banker," they said. "The banker is no longer a concern of yours," Brooks interrupted, his tone carrying absolute, unyielding authority. "There is no debt. There never was. You have my word on that. And in this city, my word is the only law that matters." He turned to his underboss. "Mateo, put 2 men on Leo's hospital room. Our best men. Not the regular crew. Use the ghosts. If anyone who isn't a doctor or Adeline tries to enter that room, break their legs and bring them to me." "Consider it done," Mateo replied, already pulling a secure phone from his pocket. Brooks turned back to Adeline. "Go back to the hospital. Stay there until I send for you." Adeline stood up, her legs wobbly. She looked at Brooks, trying to reconcile the terrifying Mafia boss of rumor with the man who had just promised her salvation. "Why?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Why are you doing this?" Brooks looked away, staring into the dark corner of his office. "Because this is my city, Adeline," he said softly. "And someone has made a mess on my floor." The atmosphere in the warehouse below Brooks's office was electric, humming with a dark, lethal anticipation. It was 11:00 p.m., the time when the city's legitimate commerce ceased and the shadow economy roared to life. Brooks stood on the metal catwalk overlooking the vast, concrete expanse. Below him, 24 men were assembled. These weren't the street-level enforcers who broke fingers for gambling debts. These were Brooks's inner circle, the mechanics, the men who dismantled problems with terrifying efficiency. They stood in quiet clusters, checking the actions of heavy-caliber weapons, sliding extra magazines into 10 quiet clusters, their faces grim and focused. There was no joking, no bravado. When Brooks called for the mechanics, it meant war. And tonight, the war was internal. Mateo walked up the metal stairs of the catwalk, his footsteps ringing out sharply. He handed Brooks a thick dossier. "It's all confirmed," Mateo said, his voice tight. "Vinny is running the shadow book. Silas is his chief collector for the hospital victims. We found the ledger. They keep it at a meatpacking plant Vinny owns near the South Docks. It's a massive operation, Brooks. They've been bleeding dozens of families. And the SUV that hit the boy, it belongs to Vinny's nephew, Paulie. They had it repaired at a chop shop we control. Strictly off the books." Brooks took the dossier, his grip tight enough to crumple the thick cardboard. The betrayal was complete, absolute, and deeply personal. Vinny had grown fat and arrogant on Brooks's peace, and he had used that peace to build an empire of pure cruelty. "Where is Vinny now?" Brooks asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Holding court at the back room of his social club on 9th, Mateo replied. "He's got his usual detail. Maybe 6 men heavily armed, plus the regular club bouncers. Silas is with him. They're celebrating a big collection week." Brooks looked down at his men. He felt a profound, heavy weariness settle into his bones. He had spent 10 years building this syndicate, unifying the warring factions, establishing a code that kept the innocent out of the crossfire. He had thought he had built something stable, something that operated with a twisted kind of honor. But looking at the dossier, he realized he had only built a prettier cage for the same old monsters. If he let Vinny live, the code was dead. Every captain would know that Brooks was weak, that they could run unsanctioned, predatory rackets without consequence. The syndicate would fracture, and the streets would run red with a turf war. If he killed Vinny, he was declaring war on his own South Side faction, risking a massive internal hemorrhage of money and loyalty. But then, he thought of Adeline in the kitchen, bleeding and terrified. He thought of the small boy in the hospital bed, paralyzed by the reckless arrogance of a man who thought he was untouchable. He thought of the sick, twisted irony of making a sister pay for the damage they had inflicted on her brother. The decision wasn't tactical. It was moral. And in Brooks's world, Moral decisions were always the bloodiest. "We don't send a hit squad," Brooks announced, his voice carrying clearly over the subtle metallic clicks of weapons being prepped below. The men stopped and looked up at him. "We don't do a drive-by. We don't hide in the shadows. This isn't a hit. This is an amputation. The rot has to be cut out in the light, where everyone can see it." He turned to Mateo. "We take the whole crew. We walk through the front door of the social club. No masks. I want Vinny to look me in the eye when his empire burns." Mateo nodded slowly, a dark smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "A public execution of his power. It sends a message. It sends the only message that matters," Brooks corrected, drawing his own heavy, customized sidearm from his shoulder holster. He checked the chamber with a smooth, practiced motion, the metallic clack echoing loudly in the cavernous space. He slammed the magazine home. "That the rules are absolute, and the penalty for breaking them is complete erasure." Brooks descended the metal stairs, his heavy footfalls sounding like a death knell. His men parted for him, a sea of dark suits and lethal intent. He didn't give a rousing speech. He didn't need to. They knew his wrath, and they trusted his judgment. "Mateo," Brooks said as he reached the ground floor, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket, preparing to step back out into the rain. "Call the hospital. Tell the ghosts guarding the boy to stay sharp. When we hit Vinny, the shockwave is going to rattle every window in the city. I don't want any stray debris hitting the innocent." "Already done, boss," Mateo said, falling in step beside him. Brooks pushed open the heavy steel doors of the warehouse, stepping out into the cold, relentless downpour. A fleet of black SUVs idled in the alley, their exhaust pluming in the damp air like dragon's breath. The storm had finally arrived, and Brooks was its violent, uncompromising center. "Let's go correct a mistake," Brooks said quietly, climbing into the lead vehicle. The Southside Gentlemen's Social Club was a front, an open secret in a neighborhood that knew better than to ask questions. From the street, it looked like a tired dive bar with heavily tinted windows and a neon sign that constantly flickered. But past the heavy oak door and the two massive bouncers, it opened into a lavish back room of red velvet booths, high-stakes poker tables, and thick cigar smoke. It was 1 a.m. when the front door imploded. There was no negotiation, no polite knocking. Brooks's mechanics hit the door with a specialized breaching ram. The oak shattered inward with a deafening crack, sending the two bouncers sprawling into the narrow hallway. Before they could reach for their weapons, Mateo and two other men were over them, disarming them with brutal, silent efficiency. Brooks walked through the shattered doorway, stepping over the groaning guards. He didn't rush. He moved with the slow, terrifying inevitability of a glacier. His coat was damp with rain, his face an emotionless mask of carved stone. Behind him, a dozen heavily armed men flooded into the hallway, moving with tactical precision, securing exits, sweeping the perimeter. They breached the main doors of the back room. The heavy, thumping bass of the jukebox was instantly drowned out by the harsh, metallic sound of a dozen assault rifles being leveled at the room's occupants. Panic erupted. A sudden, violent spasm of movement. Card players scrambled backward, knocking over chairs and spilling drinks. Women screamed, diving under the heavy oak tables. But a sharp, booming command from Mateo, "Nobody moves," froze the room in terror. Brooks ignored the chaos. His eyes swept the room, cutting through the dense cigar smoke until they locked onto the large, elevated booth at the back. Vinny the Jaw Russo was sitting there, a mountain of a man in a garish silk suit, a half-empty bottle of expensive scotch on the table in front of him. Next to him stood Silas, the enforcer looking confused and suddenly very small. Across the table was Polly, Vinny's nephew, the driver of the black SUV. Vinny's personal guards, realizing the scale of the intrusion, hesitated. They had their hands on their holsters, but they were staring down the barrels of Brooks's elite mechanics. They knew the math. It was a slaughter, not a firefight. "Stand down." Vinny barked at his guards, his voice a raspy bark. He raised his hands slowly, a false smile stretching across his wide face, attempting to project calm he clearly didn't feel. "Brooks, boss, what is this? You want to see me, you call? You don't gotta break my door down." Brooks walked through the frozen room. The patrons scrambled out of his path as if he were carrying a plague. He approached Vinny's table, stopping just out of arm's reach. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply stared at the captain. his silence far more terrifying than shouting. "We had a good run, Vinny," Brooks said softly, the quiet words carrying clearly in the terrified silence of the room. "You made me a lot of money. I gave you power. I gave you a territory. And I gave you rules." Vinny's false smile faltered. Sweat beaded on his thick forehead. "I follow the rules, Brooks. You know me. I'm a loyal earner." Brooks reached into his damp coat pocket and pulled out the thick dossier Mateo had compiled. He tossed it onto the table, the heavy folder sliding across the polished wood, knocking over Polly's drink. "A shadow book," Brooks stated, his voice devoid of anger, entirely clinical. "Extorting civilians, predatory loans on medical debt, targeting families in hospital waiting rooms." Silas paled visibly, taking a step backward. Vinny's eyes darted to the dossier, then back to Brooks. "It's a side project, boss. Small potatoes. A little extra for the boys. I was gonna kick a percentage up to you at the end of the quarter, I swear." "You used my name," Brooks continued, his voice dropping lower, colder. "You used my reputation to terrorize a waitress, to threaten a paralyzed child." Brooks shifted his gaze to Polly, the nephew, who was shaking uncontrollably. "A child that your nephew paralyzed when he ran a red light in a drunken stupor. A crime you covered up by buying the local precinct." Vinny stood up, slamming his hands on the table. "He's family, Brooks. What was I supposed to do? Let him go to prison for a mistake? And the loan. The girl needed the money. We provided a service. You provided a trap." Brooks countered, stepping closer. "You broke the code, Vinny. You brought heat on the organization by preying on the weak. You made us look like monsters." "We are monsters, Brooks," Vinny spat, his fear finally giving way to desperate anger. "Look around, we kill people, we steal, we break the law every day. Don't play saint with me over some poor waitress. This is the business." "It is the business," Brooks agreed softly. "But there is a line between being a wolf and being a parasite. I tolerate wolves. I eradicate parasites." Brooks didn't give an order. He didn't have to. Mateo stepped forward from the shadows. With a heavy, suppressed thwip, a single, silenced shot rang out. Vinny's eyes went wide, the argument dying on his lips. He collapsed heavily back into the velvet booth, his silk suit ruined, the life draining from him instantly. Polly screamed, a high, reedy sound, scrambling backward. Silas raised his hands in a frantic gesture of surrender. "Boss, please. I was just following orders. He made me do it." Brooks looked at Silas, remembering the way the brute had shoved Adeline in the rain. "You liked it, Silas. You liked the power." Brooks turned his back on the booth, addressing Mateo. "Take everything in the safe. Burn the shadow ledgers. And take these too." He gestured dismissively towards Silas and Polly, to the docks. "They're going to learn how to hold their breath." As Brooks walked out of the social club, the wails of the condemned echoing behind him, he felt no triumph. Only the heavy, exhausting realization that keeping the darkness at bay required a constant, terrible vigilance. But as he stepped back out into the cleansing rain, he knew the cancer was gone. Now, it was time to heal the collateral damage. The morning sun fought its way through the persistent city smog, casting long, pale rays of light through the large windows of the private hospital ward. The rhythmic, steady beep of the heart monitor, a sound that had terrorized Adeline for months, now felt like a gentle lullaby. Adeline sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair beside Leo's bed. She hadn't slept in 36 hours, her body running entirely on adrenaline and a fragile, blooming hope. The two large, silent men in dark suits who had stood guard outside the door all night had vanished an hour ago, replaced by a nurse who carried a bewildering piece of paperwork. The paperwork stated that the entire balance of Leo's medical debt, the surgeries, the room, the upcoming physical therapy had been paid in full by an anonymous donor. Furthermore, an irrevocable trust had been established in Leo's name, ensuring he would receive the best private care available for the rest of his life. Adeline was still staring at the paper, tears of pure relief blurring the numbers. When the heavy hospital door opened with a soft click, Brooks stepped into the room. He looked entirely out of place amid the sterile white walls and cheerful get-well balloons. He was wearing a fresh, charcoal suit, looking remarkably rested for a man who had orchestrated the dismantling of a criminal faction hours prior. He carried no flowers, no gifts. He just brought a quiet, overwhelming presence. Adeline stood up quickly, dropping the paperwork. "Mr. Brooks," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. She wanted to hug him, to fall to her knees and thank him, but she was still inherently terrified of the power he wielded. She settled for gripping the metal railing of Leo's bed like a lifeline. The nurse, the paperwork. "It was you, wasn't it?" Brooks stopped at the foot of the bed, looking down at the sleeping boy. The heavy bandages were still there, the halo still rigidly holding his neck, but his breathing was deep and peaceful. "A tragic accident," Brooks said softly, his voice devoid of its usual gravelly edge. "It's a cruel city, Adeline. Sometimes, the city needs to balance the scales." "The banker." Adeline hesitated, afraid that speaking the name might summon the nightmare back. "Silas? The debt is cancelled," Brooks said firmly, finally meeting her eyes. "The men who held it are no longer operating in this city. They will never bother you, or your brother, again. You are entirely free." Adeline covered her mouth with her hand, a fresh wave of tears spilling over her cheeks. The crushing, suffocating weight that had rested on her chest for 6 months simply evaporated. "I don't know how to repay you," she sobbed softly. "I'll work double shifts. I'll clean the floors every night. Brooks raised a hand, stopping her frantic promises. "You owe me nothing, Adeline. In fact, my organization owed you a profound apology. An apology that was delivered last night." He didn't elaborate on the blood it cost to deliver that apology. She didn't need to know the darkness he waded through to bring her the light. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a crisp, heavy envelope, placing it gently on the small table next to her chair. "This is severance. 3 months' pay. Take the time. Be with your brother. When he is stable, when he is in therapy and you are ready to work again, you call Mateo. But you won't be washing dishes or serving tables. I need people I can trust. People who understand the value of loyalty and the cost of survival. You have a spine made of iron, Adeline. I could use that in my legitimate businesses." Adeline stared at him, entirely overwhelmed. "Why?" she asked again, the same question she had asked in his office. You're a powerful man. You didn't have to care about us." Brooks looked back at Leo. The boy shifted slightly in his sleep, a small, pained grimace crossing his face before settling back into rest. Brooks thought of the empire he had built, the blood on his hands, the endless cycle of violence. He had spent his life accumulating power to protect himself, only to realize that true power was the ability to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. "I found a waitress crying in my kitchen," Brooks said quietly, a faint, rare ghost of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "And her secret reminded me of the man I originally set out to be, before the city tried to turn me into a monster." He turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back as he opened it. "Take care of your brother, Adeline. And buy yourself a new apron. The old one is ruined." The door clicked shut, leaving Adeline alone in the sunlit room. The paperwork of her salvation clutched tightly in her hands. The city outside was still a dark, dangerous place, a labyrinth of shadows and predators. But as Adeline looked at her sleeping brother, she knew that in the heart of that darkness, there was a king who possessed a terrifying, uncompromising mercy. And for the first time in 6 months, she breathed deeply, closed her eyes, and felt completely safe. True strength isn't found in the power to destroy, but in the rare, unwavering courage to protect the vulnerable, even when it means tearing down your own empire to do what is right. Brooks discovered that his greatest legacy wasn't fear, but the unexpected mercy he extended to a desperate sister in his kitchen. Thank you for reading this intense journey of redemption and hidden truths. If Adeline's fight for her brother and Brooks's transformative choice moved you, please leave a like. Share this story with someone who appreciates a powerful, grounded drama, and subscribe to the channel for more cinematic, real-life narratives.